Well, let's get started. I'm glad to be back. I was had to suffer through Los Angeles for a whole week last week, going to various meetings I had to do. So today we're going to be turning from the details of global climate change and the scientific data that backs it, which is, multitudinous. That data that you saw, and the advantage is that since we have all of these classes videotaped, you can go back and look at the videotape, and you can actually get to go through a lot of the graphs and the details that John had here. So it wasn't intended. I don't want you to panic. It isn't intended that you've memorized those charts yet. No, you're not going to have to do that. But today we're going to turn our attention to the politics of global climate change, and we're going to be starting to, at least at the very beginning here, start to discuss the climate change deniers in their arguments versus the people who are sort of the champions of the anti-global climate change movement around the planet. And there's some examples of some of these climate deniers that we could spend a lot of time going through a lot of their really inane comments. But I just want to share a few of them with you at the beginning. In the face of all of the evidence that you saw last Tuesday and Thursday that John Conway presented to you, you have people like Senator James Inhofe. James Inhofe is the Oklahoma senator who chairs the United States Senate Committee on the Environment and Public Works. And he has, in the company of the rest of the people in this administration, like Donald Trump and Scott Pruitt, who is also from Oklahoma, was the Attorney General from Oklahoma, a big oil state. And Pruitt had been made by Trump to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And Pruitt, in his career as the Attorney General of Oklahoma, had filed numerous lawsuits against the Environmental Protection Agency, asserting that they didn't have the power or the authority to be promulgating the rules that they were doing. And of course, this is a huge oil state dominated by the Kerr-McGee Petroleum Corporation. And the Kerr of Kerr-McGee is Robert S. Kerr, who was the 8-time congressman from Oklahoma, and later on he was the 4-time governor of Oklahoma, and then the senator from Oklahoma, who chaired the Senate Armed Services Committee. And that's the kind of power that the Kerr-McGee Petroleum Corporation has over the state of Oklahoma. And Scott Pruitt, the Attorney General, being the mouthpiece for the oil industry, had confronted the Environmental Protection Agency repeatedly and has been made the head of it by Donald Trump. And of course, you're all aware of the fact that Rick Perry, who was the former governor of Texas, has been made the head of the Energy Secretary, the Department of Energy. And I don't know if you guys ever saw it, but when he was running for the presidency back in 2008, he listed out a number of the major agencies that he was planning to shut down. And there were 3 of them. And one of them, he said, was the Department of Education. And then another one was, and he started trying to guess, the one he forgot was, in fact, the Department of Energy. And now he has been made the head of the Department of Energy, which he has vowed to shut down. And what he's doing is basically turning around and promulgating massive development of oil and petroleum. He, in fact, is the vice president of Sunoco Logistics, one of the partners in the Energy Transfer Partners Corporation that is building the Dakota Access Pipeline. And of course, there is, in fact, Rex Tillerson, who was the original Secretary of State. We touched upon that earlier in the early lectures, but as the Secretary of State, he in fact had been given the highest award ever given to a non-Russian by the Russian government for his having crafted a potential contract between ExxonMobil and the Russian government for developing the petroleum resources in the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And so that this group of people that are dominating the administration have as a major ally in the United States Senate Senator James Inhofe. And Inhofe, as I said, has said such sterling things as the global climate change campaign is nothing but a political machine sending out its partisan snake oil salesmen, misleading the American public regarding their purely political agenda under the mere guise of trying to protect the environment. And he said that it is the natural variability of the climate that is really going on here, not anything caused by fossil fuel emissions. And he said the satellite data has confirmed, and balloon measurements confirm, that there's no meaningful warming that has occurred at all over the past century. He just sort of says it in the face of all of the contrary evidence that you've seen. And without going on and on about these bizarre things that he says and these other people say, he actually states that no one has seriously demonstrated any scientific proof that increased global temperatures will cause any kind of adverse consequences as are predicted by the alarmists. In fact, it appears that exactly the opposite is true, that these increases in global temperatures will actually have a beneficial effect upon the way that people live on the planet. So you can see that they just go on and on like this, but the fact of the matter is that the back and forth on these things, here's all the scientific evidence in support of global climate change, here are all these kind of inane, kind of apodictic statements that are being made by Trump and the Republican leadership that it's not happening, that it's a hoax perpetrated by China to undermine our industrial base, all of these other rather ludicrous things that they say. All of this is just introductory to what's really going on here. And what we're dealing with in this course is what is really going on here. That what we want to maintain here in this course, and we want you to become familiar with the data that supports this thesis, and that is that ever since the end of World War I, basically in 1918, there has been going on the planet this major dialectical struggle, kind of a bipolar struggle that's been going on. And it hasn't been really just the United States government versus the Soviet Union in the long-time Cold War. It has been, in fact, something more long-lasting. It, in fact, has been a continuation of the effort on the part of the robber barons in the United States that rose to power in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War, rose to power over a very short span of approximately 30 years, from the end of the American Civil War in 1868 to 1898. These people rose into a position of power engined primarily by the creation of a new type of business vehicle. And this was the private shareholder-owned corporation. And what happened is at the end of the Civil War, the major northern industrialists and the financial managers of the major urban areas in the north began to get their corporate lawyers appointed to the federal judgeships. And these federal judges, over a period of time between 1868 and in 1880, a fairly short period of time, what they did is they promulgated an entire doctrine that corporations were in fact people, that a corporation was a person, that the corporation had the same fundamental constitutional rights that an individual person had. And then they waged war from that position, insisting that the government, state or federal, could not in fact regulate the corporations, to keep the corporations from doing a whole series of things they were doing, such as polluting the rivers, pumping all of the waste materials from manufacturing into the rivers, polluting the air, monopolizing entire areas of the economy, such as the railroads, the steel mills, the agricultural field, all of these major area, textile mills, these were all being monopolized by a handful of some 24 to 40 or so major robber barons that became quite famous in American history as robber barons. There has been an attempt of late, basically since the election of Ronald Reagan back in 1980 up until now, there's been an effort to revisit that entire history and to change the national view of the robber barons. There was a major campaign to change the textbooks in the United States from referring to the robber barons and having them called the captains of industry. You'll see it actually if you go to the Wikipedia page. Interesting, you go to the Wikipedia page on robber barons, and you'll see how the corporations have wangled their way into Wikipedia, in that they've kind of inserted into any kind of the sites they have there that these are older views. This viewing of the robber barons as somehow adverse to the public interest, that they were somehow unfair or unethical, is kind of been eclipsed with newer thinking. But the fact of the matter is, this dynamic has been going on, the rise of the robber barons, since the very end of the American Civil War, because, and I had touched upon it in the early lecture or two, that the school books have taught the American studentry that the Civil War was fought because of slavery, that the North, being more elevated and educated and intelligent, thought that slavery was a really bad idea, and the people in the South, being kind of backwards and uneducated and slave owners living on plantations, that rose up and rebelled against the United States government because they wanted to keep slavery. And somehow the Northern heroes were there to do away with slavery. Well, the fact of the matter is, slavery was not outlawed by the federal government until way into the Civil War. The Civil War had already been going on, and the more sophisticated analysis of history shows that the conflict that broke out into the American Civil War really was incipient from the very beginning, because I want to talk to us today about this confrontation that I'm talking about, this dialectical struggle that has been going on in earnest since the end of World War I, that is a white, male-driven, nation-state-based, elitist-led, corporate, capitalist, imperial venture. Basically, the quest to establish full-spectrum dominance over the planet through its economic hegemony and military hegemony. And their objectives were to capture the instrumentalities of the state, of the United States government, to do their bidding, to basically open markets all through South America, for example. And they waged this war with the support of the people in Congress because the major corporations were paying for their campaigns, just outrightly, publicly, delivering huge, bags full of cash to the Senate in House campaigns. And that was going on all during the robber baron era. And that movement has never stopped. And in fact, it was, as I said, there from the beginning. And I want to just touch upon it. This isn't exactly just a history class. Those I pointed out, those of you who are history majors can in fact get credit for this course by going and talking to the heads of the history department, and that they will give you permission probably for getting full credit towards your major here in this. But history is extraordinarily important in trying to understand what it is that's happening today. And that is, as I'm saying, happening today. We'll talk on Thursday. Here comes the Mueller report. Here's the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives digging into the report to try to find information that shows that Donald Trump has been using the instrumentalities of the state to enrich himself, that he's a fraud, that he has got compromised business relationships with Russia, and this major dynamic that's going on in our lives right now. If when you go home tonight, when you get done with your studies, and you turn on MSNBC News to watch the news, or you turn on CNN, or you turn on any one of the national news shows, I guarantee you, within 1 minute, you're going to start hearing the talk about this thing, about the fact that the Mueller report's coming out, the fact that the Democrats in Congress are trying to figure out a way to impeach Trump. That's going to hit you right in the face. And there's going to be at least one or more other stories about the consequences of global climate change. They're going to show the reservations underwater up in South Dakota, in the other 85% of the counties in Nebraska. They're going to show, potential massive storms coming in to, blow out Texas or Florida or others. That you're going to see these two stories sort of dominating. And you will, within the very near future, as summer comes on, you're going to start seeing more and more stories about the uprisings against the pipelines that they're trying to build all through Middle America. They're trying to suck the oil out of North Dakota and the southern Canada and pump it out all the way down through the country, down to the Gulf of Mexico, or to the Pacific, with regard to the Canadian pipeline, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, so they can ship it out and sell it to foreign countries, not to supply any kind of energy needs or for our country at all. So all of this posturing about it being super patriotic to support the building of these oil pipelines is completely ludicrous. Okay, and it's contradicted directly by the facts themselves. So that this quest for full spectrum dominance that they're engaged in, what I'm really saying is that there's this struggle going on, and I'm going to touch briefly upon its deeper history, very briefly here today, but we'll emphasize in the course focusing on after the end of World War I in 1918. But what I want to point out is I don't want you to think that all of a sudden it just sprang into being, at the end of World War I, because this thing actually started all the way back with the founding of the country. And you'll get a look at this, and that is that there were two basic factions that were operative at the founding of the United States Constitution. And one of them were the Federalists that you've heard about. And the Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was an attorney, extraordinarily bright, very ambitious, and very effective. And he represented a lot of the major banks in financial houses and industrialists, manufacturers. He was the lawyer for them. And he plied his trade to get them empowered by having a major new federal government set up. Because prior to that time, there were the 13 colonies. And this all you know, there were the 13 colonies. And the business people and the bankers and the financiers were distressed over the fact that each of the 13 colonies had its own currency. They had different weights and measures for commodities. And so that this mercantile group started lobbying like mad with the Continental Congress, where the representatives from the 13 colonies came and sat together basically as equals under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were drawn up after the victory in the American Revolutionary War, predicated upon the form of collective decision-making that had been adopted by the 5 Indian nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, that there were 5 Native American tribes up in northern New England, actually in northern New York, up along the Canadian border of the St. Lawrence River, the Mohawks and the Iroquois and the Onondaga and the Seneca, and that they were up in that territory. And they had decided, like 1,000 years ago, that it was really foolish for them to be fighting with each other. And so what they did is they had an agreement that if any kind of a disagreement arose between 2 of the tribes or the tribal members, that the medicine men of each of the 5 tribes would come together and they would participate in a sweat, which was this sweat lodge, this like igloo type structure, in which they would come in and they would all sit in a circle inside this igloo, and there was a hole in the ground where these superheated red rocks would be rolled in and put into the center, and the leader of the ceremony, the sweat ceremony, would throw water onto the rocks, and it would generate this intense steam that would fill up the sweat lodge, and it was an ordeal of pain, actually, for these medicine people, and that they would actually, though it does, you won't find this in any of your contacts with as white people. Most of you are non-Native Americans. You won't find out about this, but in the kind of sweat lodges any of you might ever get to participate in. But the way they do it with the medicine men is they would keep on bringing these hot rocks into the thing, throwing water on them until 2 of the medicine men passed out from pain. And then they would then they would open up the sweat lodge and let all the scalding hot steam out. And then one of them that passed out first would sing a song and chant and tell what his visions were when he was passed out. And then he'd be all done. And then the second one would chant what his visions were when he was passed out. And then in that particular case, the medicine man from the Mohawk tribe, the people of Flint, who was a member of the Wolf Clan, selected by the women of the Turtle Clan, that he would, in fact, weave the 2 visions together in a song. And it would tell them how to resolve the conflict between the 2 tribal members. And so that's how it was done. But they had this alliance they called Akwesasne, which was the Great White Roots of Peace. And this confederation they had of the 5 Indian nations, later became 6 Indian nations, but it was the 5 Indian Nation Confederacy, was visited by Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, and they came to understand how this confederacy had been established, and they used that as the model for the 13 colonies. So they had articles of confederation among the 13 colonies, all of which were equal, and they would come together, and then they would try to resolve their differences in what was called the Continental Congress. Now, because the 13 colonies each kept their own separate currency and their own system of weights and measures and other things, the bankers and the mercantilists and the manufacturers were trying to get some sort of common set of agreements to govern commerce. And so they started lobbying to set up a stronger, more centralized government that could have the power to do things like have a central bank with a central currency for all of them, and an agreement on central weights and measures, et cetera, and rules and regulations governing commerce primarily. These people perceived everything through the commercial lens. Everything had to do with mercantilism and business. And there was another element, however, inside the colonies that was led by, in its actuality, by James Madison. James Madison and Aaron Burr. And these two men, along with Thomas Jefferson, were in fact what is referred to in John Rawls, the chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University, has written a book called A Theory of Justice. It's a profound and important book for all philosophy students to study. He undertook a study of the theory of justice in Western civilization, and he thought that in a popular democracy, when a community is confronted with a particular public policy challenge or problem, that the likelihood is, in a democratic society, that they would choose the option that generated the greatest good for the greatest number. But what he actually discovered when was it that I first read that? It was 1973 when he published it. What he actually discovered is that if that were true, then why is it in the United States that the white people that were the clear majority didn't still own the black people? Because that was actually a majoritarian, utilitarian benefit for them, and yet they didn't do that. And he said that the reason they didn't is because the simple majoritarian, utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning in the democracy had been tempered by a group they called the intuitionists. And these intuitionists, such as James Madison and Aaron Burr and others, turns out they had all been schooled at the College of New Jersey, which later went on to be renamed Princeton University. That these people were instructed by a man by the name of John Witherspoon. And this is something that you could spend another 20 years in college and nobody's going to tell you. But it's important for you to understand this, is that John Witherspoon at the College of New Jersey between 1768 and 1794, some almost 30 years, taught all of these people a system of moral philosophy that was rooted in natural law. Now, you have heard mention of the fact that it was a natural law theory that undergirds the Constitution of the United States. When the Constitution says such thing as all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that there are natural law rights that inure to a person as a human being, they're essential elements of our humanity. All of this talk is having to do with natural law. And natural law was taught at the College of New Jersey by John Witherspoon, and he taught not only James Madison and Aaron Burr and William Bradford, who was the original governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but he actually taught over the years 37 federal judges. 3 of whom became United States Supreme Court justices. He taught 10 cabinet members. He taught 21 United States senators and 39 U.S. congressmen during his years. And he taught them all this theory of natural law. And we'll have some discussions about that as the weeks go forward so that we get a clearer understanding of what the mode of ethical reasoning is that was deployed by the people who are the intuitionists or the natural law advocates. But these people are in direct confrontation with these federalists that were openly advocating that all voting in the federal government be restricted to white male property owners, and that they believed in a theory of elitism, that the industrialists and the business people were better educated, they were from better families, they were driven by business and self-interest. But the fact of the matter is they believed that they should have the right to govern. And these other people, the intuitionists, the Madisonians, believed that people, men and women together, and non-property owners, had a right to participate in their own decision-making. And so that there was this tension that took place right at the founding of the United States Constitution. And the Federalists, the Hamiltonians, managed to get put into the Constitution the fact, for example, and many of you probably don't know this yet, but that citizens were not allowed to vote for the senators at all. That you were allowed to, the decision as to whether you were going to get to vote at all was made by your state. And they're the ones that required you being white male property owners. And that you could vote for your congressional representative. And that's all. And then the state legislature would choose who was going to be the senator from the state. And you could not vote for the president. You could only vote for a certain person to go to participate in the Electoral College. You would select one of these well-heeled individuals to go to participate in Washington in the Electoral College to decide who they wanted the president to be. But that's all that you could do. And that was enshrined. All of those things were enshrined in the Constitution that was ratified in 1789. Now, the intuitionists or the Madisonians were insisting, however, that there be a Bill of Rights put into the Constitution that would announce the fundamental natural law theory that is undergirding the Constitution. And they insisted upon these rights in the Constitution, and you're very familiar with these: the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment right of free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. These are things that are put in the Second Amendment, which is, there's some debate about, as you know, that a well-regulated militia being necessary for the maintenance of a free nation, that the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And then they go down through the other famous amendments. The Fourth Amendment, became the rights of privacy, that you have the right not to have your house searched or your papers or effects searched by the state without a warrant issued on probable cause, etc. There's a whole panoply of these. But very importantly, there is in the Bill of Rights, again, something that you might not hear much about, but when you get through all of these Bill of Rights, there is a Ninth Amendment. And the Ninth Amendment says that the enumeration in this Constitution of certain specific rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage the existence of others, which are retained by the people. So the entire premise was that there are a panoply of natural law rights that an individual has over and against the collective and over and against the state. And then it says in the 10th Amendment, it says the powers not specifically delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor expressly prohibited by it to the states, are reserved, respectively, to the people or the states. Okay? What they mean is that the people are represented by the states at the time, but the people are the ones who reserve these rights to themselves, and it is by dint of natural law that people possess these rights. So that right from the very, very beginning of the founding of the Constitution, you had these two elements. These Hamiltonian elitists who believed in the white supremacy, the mastery of the males over the females, the right of property owners over non-property owners, the right of an elite educated to rule, and to have all the decisions being basically prisoned through commerce and business profits. Basically, what's good for business is good for the community. Okay? And on the other hand, you had these intuitionists who believed that the government that governs least governs best, and the individuals ought to be left to their own devices to be happy, and that they should be allowed to have a fair share of whatever products are developed through labor of people, that the people who participate in giving their labor to the development of these different products, agrarian products and others, ought to have a fair share in these. Now, what we're going to be talking about during the course of the rest of the lectures and courses is that this social democratic movement that arose in the United States, confronting the elitists, the federalists, this other intuitionist group was known as the Democratic Republicans. That was what they were known as, the Democratic Republicans versus the Federalists. Now, some people have referred to them as the Anti-Federalists, but their actual literal name was the Democratic Republicans, and they are often referred to as the Jeffersonians, but they're actually the Madisonians. It was James Madison that was the principal author of the Constitution. He had drafted the Virginia Constitution. He was the major drafter of the Constitution itself. And what we're going to point out is that this confrontation, this dialectical contest between these two elements has been going on ever since the founding of the country. And there were a series of issues over which they clashed, and I'll touch on those briefly. But the point that I'm going to be making in the course, and I want us to all understand is, and you feel free to critique it and do research on your own to determine whether you believe this is true. And there are writings that are set forth, at least in the original of this much larger syllabus that we had. I had like about a 25-page syllabus, but my TAs beat up on me and said, you can't do that. And I was just saying, look, these are just for reference. You can read all these things. I wanted to make sure you knew where both sides of the arguments were on this. They said, no, it's got to be more streamlined and a little easier for the folks. And I said, fine. But for any of you who want the other syllabus, you'll get an extra point. No, I won't say that. I won't say you get an extra point. But anyway, but anybody who wants to see the other syllabus, you can contact me and I'll make it available. And you can have it so that you can link into all of these other potential readings that we have on this. But the thesis that I want to point out, and I want to bring it up to this time, at least in this lecture, and that is that this entire confrontation that was going on from the founding of the Constitution played itself out in a confrontation between the Federalists on the one side and the Democratic Republicans on the other side, over such things as the demand on the part of the Federalists to have a national bank, a U.S. government bank. And there was a huge fight over that. and the Federalists wanted to have the federal bank, and they wanted to have the federal bank be able to create money by if they had, say, well, if they had $1 million on deposit, they wanted to be able to lend the portions of the money out to people and gain interest on the money and put it into the bank, and they were authorized to be able to lend more money than they actually had, because the people that they loaned the money to weren't going to be spending it all at one time, and they're going to be paying interest, et cetera. So they were able to multiply money. There's a whole long discussion about fractional banking that we'll talk about a little bit later. But that was one of the major confrontations. Another one was the expansion, that the Federalists wanted to expand their territory. They were the major champions of Manifest Destiny. They wanted to go and take the land away from the Native American people. They wanted to be able to build rail lines out there. They wanted to have mining interests, far-flung mining interests in the native territories, et cetera. And the Democratic Republicans didn't want that. They thought that diminished the value of their representation as states. And there were a series of confrontations that went on between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans that went on through the years. But it basically came to a head in the American Civil War. And it wasn't at all exclusively over slavery. It was over the relative authority of the states to make decisions. And the Federalists kept on drawing more and more authority into the central federal government to be able to make decisions that were beneficial primarily to the financial interests in the country. And they were continuing to do this, and the Democratic Republicans were resisting them. And it finally came to a head because the Northern industrialists wanted to prohibit having any type of slavery extend into any of the Western territories. They wanted to have workers in there. They wanted to have workers that they could employ for next to nothing, and they didn't have to house them. They didn't have to feed them. They could pay them the absolute minimal amounts and extract the maximum amount of work from them. And the Southerners who were opposing expansion in its entirety said that if you're going to expand, we have to be able to move some of our and increase our agricultural holdings there, and we have a right to utilize the slaves that we have to do that. Now, that can become a touchy subject, because you certainly can't consider those type of people to be heroes in any way of championing the right to bring their slaves into the Western territories. But it was really just a particular form that the argument took over the argument about the comparative authority of the states vis-a-vis these elite industrialists. Okay, and so that when the war ended and the Northern industrialists and financiers won the Civil War, they went right to it, starting in 1868. And as I mentioned, they started putting their corporate lawyers, their big business lawyers, into the courts. They established the doctrine of the corporation being a person. This person had fundamental constitutional rights that prohibited any of the government from regulating them or restricting their rights to engage in contract, et cetera. And so they rose to the ascendancy. And that the most important single thing that those rulings did was they completely immunized the owners of the stock from any personal liability of anything that the corporation did. And so right from the beginning, these corporations were just their assets that were in the bank owned by that corporation is all that was subject to liability for anything that the corporation did. And a stockholder could own 60% of all the profits and 60% of all of the resources of the corporation, but they were totally immunized against any liability. So if that corporation decided to pump poison out of their factory, say a leather factory or a tannery or something like that, into the river, and poison all the fish and poison all the farmland, that there was no cause of action against the owners of the stock. They would just sit back and get the profits, but they had no liability. The management of the corporation had no personal liability. The boards of directors had no personal liability. It was just the corporation itself, that person. And it was just the assets of that person that were subject to judgments. And that was a disastrous formula. Because when you put together a business vehicle like that, the management are being driven by the effort to maximize the profits so that they can increase the shares that are being paid out, the profits to the shareholders. So you've designed a fundamental sort of sinful structure of the private shareholder-owned business corporation. And true to its nature, those corporations began to wreak havoc on the country. That they monopolized entire areas where they would go into a community and they would completely crush any of the competition in there. If you had a small farm and you were wanting to sell your grain, for example, they would come in and they would insist upon buying your land. If you wouldn't sell your land, what they would do is they would send Pinkertons actually to burn your crops down. They thought that was more or less fair because they viewed themselves as being in a war with any of their competitors, and they would buy them out or they would burn them out. They would go to the banks and refuse to give any loans to the other farmers, so they couldn't buy seed grain. They couldn't buy any kind of horses or plows or stuff for their food, and they would engage in all of these types of activities that became characteristic of the robber baron era. And this issue of expansion, this doctrine of manifest destiny, they kept insisting that this elite, these white elite males that were better educated and came from better families, who had a right to govern, they had a right to engage in this quest of taking control of the entire landmass of North America. In that they could throw out all the native people, kill the native people, put out bounties on the native people, any scalp. In fact, the tradition of scalping started with them, that they had to produce the scalp of a native person in order to get the $100 reward for killing one of the native people. So there was a conscious program of attempting to exterminate the native people to take their land so you could get at their resources. Okay, so this doctrine of manifest destiny was driving the Federalist doctrines throughout this period. And what I'm going to be pointing out to you during the course is that this struggle between the elite landed aristocracy, the white male-dominated corporate aristocracy, that the battlefield on which this played itself out ended up being oil. Because at the end of World War I, as we're going to talk about here in a minute, that there was this thing started happening, that the robber barons that had risen to power between 1868 and 1898, by the time they got to 1900, they were poised to basically, they had control of the United States military. They could, for example, in 1903, they got the United States government to send a foreign military expeditionary force into Nicaragua to overthrow the democratically elected government in Nicaragua on behalf of United Fruit. United Fruit wanted to be able to grow bananas and things down in Nicaragua, and they didn't want to have to pay any taxes. And so when the government there tried to tax them for that, they brought in the military. United States Marines went in, an expeditionary force under General Smedley Butler actually led that particular operation. And they did it repeatedly, time after time after time. They would intervene. They went in, intervened, and took over Panama to build the canal. for commerce, so that they could save money by not having to go around the Horn, and they would come through that was all done by the United States government. Everything was being done for the benefit of the corporations, okay? And this rampant national imperialism that the United States was engaged in was also being engaged in by other countries in Europe, which of course led to the First World War, is the fundamental clash between Germany and France and England and the other countries. But what I want to do today, in the time that we have, is I want to just point out that this effort to impeach Trump, that Trump is the absolute paradigmatic example of a robber baron, who cheats and lies and connives and tries to monopolize and dominate everybody. And the fact that he has risen to the head of the Republican Party, which is the progeny of the Federalists, is not at all coincidental. Is completely consistent with the history of the entire Federalist Party. Okay, and that my objective today is to really get you to understand the deeper understanding of what's going on behind the impeachment, because the effort to get him impeached, as distinct from getting him unelected in 2020, this effort that is being led by people, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or the effort to get him impeached is an attempt to impeach the concept of the robber barons, is to impeach that idea, to try to purge that idea from the body politic. Not just to say, well, you got your arguments and we've got ours, and we'll go in, we'll have an election, and if you win, we'll lay back and let you rape and pillage and destroy the environment, destroy the planet, because, well, you won in a kind of a fair fight. And unless we can prove that the fight was unfair, like that you brought in Russia to try to help you, unless we can prove that overwhelmingly, we're just going to leave you in. That's Nancy Pelosi, that's Chuck Schumer, that's the new, more moderate Democratic Party. That's their position. But there is a Justice Democratic movement inside the Democratic Party and outside the Democratic Party and the Green Party and others to impeach him, to expunge the legitimacy of this type of conduct from the body politic. Not to have it just be considered one of the two positions, and it's sometimes worse and sometimes less worse, but we know what it is, and it's always here. This effort to get rid of it, to purge it from our culture, is what is motivating the impeachment movement, and that we're going to be talking about that as we go on. Now, what I want to point out here is that there are certain elements of the robber baron era that are being replayed right now, and I want to point out that while this phenomenon has been going on since the founding of the country, and went on all the way between 1889 and the founding of the Constitution, 1891, the passage of the Bill of Rights, all the way on up through to 1864 in this American Civil War. And it became intensified after the war between 1868 and 1898 during the robber baron era. That it was at play. The clash of imperial powers were at play in World War I. And at the very end of World War I, where we start here in the closing portions of this lecture, is at the end of World War I, the Allied powers that's the United States that came in, and France and Britain it came in. The United States came in against Germany. And remember, Germany was allied not with Japan, which was the Second World War, but in the First World War, they were allied with Turkey, which was the Persian Empire. And so Germany and Turkey were the opponent in World War I. And when they were vanquished at the end of World War I, the Allied powers established a commission, and it was chaired by Winston Churchill from the United Kingdom. He was, in fact, the Minister for Colonial Affairs of the United Kingdom. They put together a 22-person commission, 21 men and 1 woman, and they imposed artificial boundaries over the entire Middle East. And they superimposed the nation-state system that had been adopted in Europe by the Treaty of Westphalia in, I think, 1647 or so. And the concept of the nation-state had been decided upon by the royal families in Europe. That, look, let's stop having all these fights over the boundaries and who has what rights. Let's have clear national boundaries. Let's have a nation-state entity, and the royal family will rule over that nation-state. And we'll have rules of engagement, etc. And what they did in 1922, after the end of the war, what they did is this commission superimposed these boundaries, these nation-state boundaries, on the Middle East. And that's why you have these peculiar, they look like boxes with these straight lines, you know, and they've got Lebanon and Yemen and Libya and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. They've got all of these areas all carved up. And what they did is this commission handpicked one of the tribes. This was a tribal territory. These are Aboriginal indigenous people that lived throughout this area of the world, but they were subject to the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire. And so when Turkey and the Persian Empire lost World War I, the Western powers came in, took control of those areas, superimposed these artificial boundaries, and then they handpicked one of the tribes inside that geophysical area and made them the king. The head of the family was made the king. And then what they did is they put them in power, and they provided military equipment to them and funding to them to establish hegemony over that physical territory.